DNA, the genetic material of life. You're watching Sci-Find with me, Cao Ton Sombun. When talking about DNA, many of you might know it can be used to identify who a child's parents are, or maybe identifying the correct criminal in a crime, right? But few people know that, in fact, there are lots of hidden secrets inside our DNA. DNA is the short version of deoxyribonucleic acid. So, this is what DNA looks like. It has a shape of two spiral lines similar to a spiral staircase. This spiral staircase-like shape is also known as a double helix. DNA is the genetic material that determines the characteristics of all living organisms. To explain it easier, my DNA makes me, Cao Ton Sombun, someone with black wavy hair with this specific skin tone. Likewise, your DNA makes someone who you are. And since we're all humans, our DNA is 99% identical. But just the 1% that's left is enough to make us different and uniquely identifiable from others. Also, did you know that our body consists of more than 30 trillion cells? And each cell performs a different function. Some cells function as bone cells, which forms the structure of our body. Some cells make up the brain, and some cells form our skin. When all these cells come together, they form a human being like me or you. Now, how does each cell know what to do? Well, the answer is within our DNA. DNA acts like the big boss who commands the cells to perform their respective jobs. To put it simply, DNA is like a guideline or a blueprint, which controls the function of each cell for all living organisms, whether they are humans, dogs, trees, or even bacteria. So, how does DNA give out the commands? We need to get to know the structure of DNA better first. DNA is classified as a large molecule of a nucleic acid type. Similar to proteins or carbohydrates, larger molecules are formed by sequencing smaller compounds. As for the proteins, they use amino acids as an organic compound. Organic compounds are carbohydrates, like starch or sugar. But for DNA, the organic compound is called a nucleotide. Within the nucleotide, there are three elements consisting of sugars, phosphates, and a nitrogenous base, or a base that contains nitrogen. When these compounds are combined, they will form a double helix shape like this. Sugar and phosphates are formed like the sides of a ladder, but the steps of the ladder are the nitrogenous base. The sides of the ladder connect them together. If we take a closer look at each step, we can see that each of the steps have four different colors. These four colors represent the four types of nitrogenous bases. A is adenine, T is thymine, C is cytosine, and G is guanine. And the way each base is sequenced allows the cells to follow DNA commands, like creating protein, enzymes, or hormones. The base sequence varies between every living thing. It is a genetic code specific to each person or organism. When we have children, the parents pass on our base sequences to our children who inherit the parents' DNA to continue the family and species traits. So, how long is one strand of DNA in a person? The DNA of a person has 3 billion pair bonds. And if we pulled the DNA out of a single cell and stretched it out, it would be about 3 meters long. Now, you might ask yourself, how does 3 meters of DNA fit into every one of our cells? Well, the DNA in the cell curls tightly at the middle point of the cell, which is called the nucleus. This is like the command center of the DNA. We see that the DNA curl tightly like the shape of youtiao when the cells start dividing. This youtiao-like shape is called the chromosome. We humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 pairs are the body chromosomes, and the last pair is what determines your gender at birth. In each chromosome, there are genes that determine your characteristics, whether it's hair color, eye color, or skin color. Each gene also has an unequal base length. Now, as we grow up, the cells themselves need to divide and increase their numbers. Or sometimes when we get hurt, the cells have to divide in order to repair the wound. So, when cells divide, what happens to the DNA? Does DNA divide too? The answer is that DNA must also divide, and 2 sets of DNA must be copied in order to divide them into 2 cells. Normally, our body is very clever and is able to perfectly copy the DNA, but sometimes small mistakes can happen. However, the body itself will have the job of checking for mistakes and correcting any errors in the base sequence. But if there are too many mistakes, it's possible they cannot be fixed. This can cause different genetic problems that can be passed on to our children. Some additional factors, like toxic substances or radiation, can also cause errors in the DNA sequence. It can cause errors in cell division, eventually becoming cancer cells. DNA is like a hard drive that stores an enormous amount of genetic information about us. So, can we use DNA to store information instead of an external hard drive, such as texts, pictures, music, or video files? Would this even be possible? The answer is yes, we can do it. But how is it done? If you want to know, we first need to understand how our cells normally read the data stored in our DNA. So, usually if you eat cake, it's sweet, right? And the level of blood sugar will increase. So the brain then tells the pancreas to secrete a hormone known as insulin, which helps to rebalance blood sugar levels. And the cells in the pancreas do as they're asked. Insulin is a type of protein, and we already talked about how proteins are formed by amino acids that are lined up. Now, how do pancreatic cells know which amino acids come first or last in the genetic sequence? Because there are over 20 types of amino acids, this is how it works. Base sequences are the key to determining and then interpreting the DNA commands. Our cells apply a certain method. The cells will read 3 base codes at a time and then convert the code into 1 amino acid. The cells continue to read 3 base codes at a time and will stop reading them when they reach the code that tells them to stop. At that point, hundreds of amino acids will be sequenced together, forming insulin proteins. What if we use the same function that the body uses, which is reading 3 base sequences at a time, in order to code each single amino acid and then line up one after another, forming a protein? If we use the same method and convert the code into a language we can read, then we can line up all the letters until they create a text, right? That's exactly right. In 1999, a team of American scientists used the same principle to convert DNA code into text and store information on it. They wanted to use the same system as the body, with 3 base sequences, which in turn uses 4 types of patterns, which created 64 unique patterns. These 64 patterns were represented by the English letters A to Z, as well as numbers and symbols. Scientists applied this principle to code the letters into longer sequences first. Then they edited the DNA to follow the pattern they chose. Once they had the DNA in order, they then placed the DNA code on paper, folded it, put it in an envelope, and sent it to another address. Once they got the letter, they opened it and transferred the DNA code into a base sequence reader that converted it back into letters. It turned out that they were able to read the text with 100% accuracy. This was the first starting point to prove that DNA could be used to store data. Now, in case of complex data, whether it's an image file or an audio file, can the DNA store those as well? The answer is yes. Nowadays we collect data, whether it's words, pictures, videos, or audio, in the form of digital data, easily understood by computers. They read information in a code with ones and zeros, also known as binary code. Scientists themselves were able to compare binary code and use it with the ACGT base code found inside the DNA. In 2013, there was a British scientist named Nick Goldman. He is a researcher at the European Bioinformatics Institute. He proved that it was possible to store 739 kilobytes of files within the DNA. The data included all 154 sonnets of William Shakespeare, an audio file of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech, the research paper on the discovery of the DNA structure by James Watson and Francis Crick, two Nobel Prize-winning laureates in biology, a photo of his own research institute, and a manual file on how to decode and read the data inside the DNA. He proved that he was able to store and read 100% of the data. Can you believe that DNA storage technology holds all that information? The advantage of using DNA as a data storage is because DNA can store enormous amounts of information with just a small amount of space. Theoretically, we are able to store hundreds of millions of high-definition movies with a total capacity of 400,000 terabytes in DNA that has the size of an eraser at the end of a pencil. And we are able to store all the data that is currently available on the internet around the world into DNA that is only the size of a shoebox. What's even better is that the DNA also has long life expectancy. Nowadays, we store data on computers or an external hard drive that might only last a few decades until they break down. So there's always a risk of data loss. But on the other hand, DNA's half-life is about 500 years. A half-life is the time that it takes for DNA to decay. And if we store DNA in a cold, dark place, we can store it for hundreds of thousands of years. And if you think that's not long enough, listen to this. Scientists have already found a way to store data on the DNA of bacteria. In 2017, a research team from Harvard University conducted research showing that they could use a technique called CRISPR-Cas to successfully store data onto the DNA of E. coli bacteria for the first time in history. The data that was stored was a low-resolution black and white moving image of a running horse, a classic video taken in 1978 by Edward Muybridge, who was a pioneer of high-speed photography from history. The research team took 5 days to gradually store this file onto the bacteria's DNA. But the team didn't store all the files in a single bacterium. They had to distribute the data and then stored it in several bacteria. And in order to read the data, they had to combine all these bacteria to decode the data and group them as an image file. The team was able to show and retrieve up to 90% of the data. It's pretty amazing that we can store so much information on something so tiny, right? And since bacteria can divide very quickly, they also duplicate or copy information quickly, so we don't have to be afraid that our data will be lost, since they have the capacity to back up a lot of data. Not only that, if we choose the right type of bacteria, such as Deinococcus radiodurans, nicknamed Conan the Bacterium, which is able to live in any environment, such as a place without water, or even surviving in the vacuum of space, and also has the ability to resist massive amounts of radiation 1,000 times greater than we can. These bacteria can still survive safely. This means that the data that is stored in the DNA of this type of bacteria will last for a long, long time. We'll have to keep an eye on it. In the future, DNA storage technology will be the key to opening the door to many new possibilities and will become an important factor that will change our world and our way of life.